December 23, 1944, the Belgian Ardennes. Snow falls in thick, silent curtains over the frozen forest, muffling the distant thunder of artillery. In a makeshift field hospital just 12 miles behind the collapsing American line, First Lieutenant Mary Louise Roberts crouches in mud-stained fatigues, her hands steady as she threads a needle through torn flesh. The wounded man on the table before her is unconscious, mercifully his leg shattered by shrapnel from a German 88. Outside, the Luftwaffe's engines drone closer. The tent canvas shudders. Roberts doesn't look up. Her fingers move with the precision of a surgeon. Though she is not a surgeon, she is a nurse, one of 59,000 American women serving in combat zones. And in this moment, with German panzers breaking through at Bastogne, she is all that stands between this soldier and death. The needle pierces. The thread pulls. Blood pools in the grooves of her knuckles. She works in silence, and the silence itself becomes a kind of prayer. This scene, this moment of quiet defiance against the machinery of war, was repeated thousands of times across every theater of the Second World War. Yet it exists almost nowhere in the popular memory of that conflict. When we think of World War II, we conjure images of men, soldiers storming beaches, pilots diving through flak-filled skies, tank commanders surveying burning horizons. The women, if they appear at all, are background figures, pretty faces on propaganda posters, faithful wives waiting at home, factory workers in headscarves building the weapons their husbands would wield. We have reduced their contributions to a cultural footnote, a sentimental sidebar in the grand narrative of masculine heroism. But this reduction is not merely incomplete. It is a historical distortion so profound that it borders on erasure. The truth is this: World War II could not have been won without women. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Between 1939 and 1945, millions of women across dozens of nations stepped into roles that had been unthinkable a generation earlier. They became pilots, snipers, resistance fighters, codebreakers, intelligence operatives, factory workers, engineers, and medics. They flew bombers over enemy lines, executed sabotage missions behind German defenses, decoded the ciphers that changed the course of entire campaigns, and worked 16-hour shifts producing the tanks and planes and ammunition that fed the Allied war machine. And yet in the decades since the war's end, their stories have been systematically minimized, obscured, or forgotten entirely. This is not an accident of history. It is the result of deliberate choices made in the war's aftermath. Choices about which narratives to preserve, which heroes to honor, and which contributions to bury beneath the comfortable myth of the greatest generation as an exclusively male achievement. To understand how profoundly women shaped the outcome of World War II, we must begin not with the war itself, but with the world that preceded it. In the 1930s, women in most industrialized nations lived under legal and social restrictions that would be unrecognizable today. In the United States, married women in many states could not own property, sign contracts, or open bank accounts without their husband's permission. In Britain, women had only recently gained the right to vote on equal terms with men. In Nazi Germany, the regime's official ideology relegated women to the domestic sphere: Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, and actively discouraged their participation in the workforce or public life. In the Soviet Union, women had made greater legal gains under communist rule, but traditional gender roles remained deeply entrenched in practice. Across the world, the prevailing assumption was simple: war was men's business. Women's place was in the home. Then the war came and everything changed. The transformation began not with ideology, but with necessity. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the European powers mobilized for total war, it became immediately clear that victory would require not just armies, but the complete mobilization of entire societies. Every factory, every farm, every mine and shipyard and laboratory would need to operate at maximum capacity for years on end. And there simply were not enough men to do the work. As millions of young men were conscripted into military service, nations faced a stark choice: bring women into the industrial workforce on an unprecedented scale, or lose the war. Britain moved first. By mid-1940, with France fallen and the Luftwaffe pounding London, the British government began actively recruiting women into war work. Initially, The effort relied on volunteerism and patriotic appeals. Posters urged women to come into the factories and reminded them that your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory. But volunteerism alone proved insufficient. In December 1941, Britain became the first nation in history to conscript women into war service. Under the National Service Act, all unmarried women between the ages of 20 and 30 were required to register for either military auxiliary service or essential war work. By 1943, 9 out of 10 single women and 8 out of 10 married women in Britain were employed in war-related industries or the armed forces. In total, more than 7 million British women served in roles ranging from munitions production to anti-aircraft gun crews. The United States followed a similar trajectory, though without formal conscription. Before Pearl Harbor, American women's participation in heavy industry was minimal. Cultural attitudes remained conservative, and many employers actively resisted hiring women for traditionally male jobs. But the Japanese attack on December 7, 1941, and the subsequent declaration of war against the Axis powers shattered those hesitations. Within months, the U.S. government launched a massive propaganda campaign to draw women into the workforce. The War Manpower Commission coordinated with employers, unions, and media outlets to reshape public perception. The result was Rosie the Riveter, the iconic image of a strong, capable woman in work clothes, flexing her arm beneath the slogan, "We can do it." Between 1940 and 1945, the number of American women in the workforce increased by more than 6 million. They built bombers and tanks, welded ship hulls, assembled artillery shells, and operated cranes and lathes. At the peak of wartime production, women comprised more than 1/3 of the workforce in the American aviation industry. In some munitions plants, they made up as much as 80% of all workers. These numbers tell only part of the story. What they cannot convey is the sheer scale of transformation, the speed with which millions of women learned complex technical skills and adapted to physically demanding, often dangerous work. Consider the Boeing aircraft plants in Seattle, where women assembled B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-29 Superfortresses, aircraft so large and complex that a single bomber required more than 100,000 individual parts. Before the war, virtually none of these women had ever operated industrial machinery. Many had never worked outside the home. Yet within weeks of training, they were drilling precision holes in aluminum panels, riveting fuselage sections, installing hydraulic systems, and wiring electrical components. Their work required not just physical strength but meticulous attention to detail. A single misaligned rivet could cause catastrophic structural failure at altitude. A single crossed wire could render navigation systems useless. The margin for error was zero, and the consequences of failure were measured in lives. The danger extended beyond the machinery itself. Munitions factories were among the most hazardous workplaces in the wartime economy. Women who filled artillery shells with explosive powder faced constant risk of accidental detonation. The work turned their skin yellow from exposure to TNT, earning them the nickname Canary Girls, a grim echo of the same term used for British munitions workers in the First World War. In the United States alone, industrial accidents during the war years killed more than 37,000 workers, many of them women. In Britain, German bombing raids specifically targeted industrial centers, and women working night shifts in factories became casualties of war in the most direct sense. On the night of November 14, 1940, the Luftwaffe bombed the Standard Motor Company factory in Coventry, killing dozens of women workers. Their deaths were not collateral damage. They were the intended result of a strategic bombing campaign designed to destroy Britain's capacity to produce weapons. Yet even as millions of women entered factories and shipyards, their contributions extended far beyond industrial production. In every combatant nation, women joined military auxiliary services, taking on roles that freed men for frontline combat. In Britain, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force operated radar stations, plotted aircraft movements, and maintained planes. The Women's Royal Naval Service handled communications, logistics, and intelligence work. The Auxiliary Territorial Service provided drivers, mechanics, and anti-aircraft gun crews. By 1943, more than 460,000 British women were serving in military auxiliary roles. They wore uniforms, lived under military discipline, and faced the same risks as their male counterparts when German bombs fell on their bases. In the United States, women served in the Women's Army Corps, the Navy's Waves, the Coast Guard SPARS, and the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. More than 350,000 American women enlisted in these services during the war. They worked as cryptographers, translators, mechanics, and control tower operators. They ferried aircraft from factories to air bases, flew test flights of newly repaired planes, and trained male pilots in navigation and instrument flying. The Women Air Force Service pilots, the WASPs, logged more than 60 million miles in every type of aircraft the U.S. military operated, from trainers to B-29 bombers. 38 WASPs died in service. Yet because they were classified as civilian employees rather than military personnel, they received no military honors, no burial benefits, and no recognition as veterans. It would take more than 30 years before the U.S. government officially acknowledged their service. But if the Western Allies were slow to fully integrate women into military roles, the Soviet Union took a radically different approach. From the earliest days of the German invasion in June 1941, the USSR mobilized women for direct combat on a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. Soviet ideology, rooted in Marxist principles of gender equality, had already promoted women's participation in industry and public life. When Operation Barbarossa thrust the nation into a desperate fight for survival, that ideology translated into military practice. By 1943, more than 800,000 Soviet women were serving in the Red Army, and unlike their counterparts in Britain and America, they were not limited to auxiliary roles. Soviet women fought as infantry soldiers, tank drivers, machine gunners, anti-aircraft crews, and, most famously, as pilots and snipers, the Night Witches. That was the name German soldiers gave to the all-female 588th Night Bomber Regiment, and it was not a term of endearment. It was an expression of fear. The regiment flew obsolete Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, wood and canvas aircraft designed for crop dusting, not combat. These planes were slow, flimsy, and completely unarmored. They had no radios, no guns, and no bomb sights. The pilots flew at night, navigating by compass and moonlight, dropping small bombs on German positions by hand. To avoid detection by radar and searchlights, they would climb to altitude, cut their engines, and glide silently toward their targets. The only sound was the wind whistling through the wing struts, a soft, eerie rustling that German soldiers likened to the sweeping of witches' broomsticks. Hence the name. What made the Night Witches terrifying was not the destructive power of their bombs, but the psychological toll of their constant presence. They flew multiple sorties every night, sometimes as many as 15 or 20 missions in a single 12-hour period. German soldiers on the front lines knew that the moment darkness fell, the biplanes would return. There would be no rest, no respite. Just the relentless whisper of canvas wings and the crack of explosions. Over the course of the war, the 588th flew more than 23,000 combat missions and dropped approximately 3,000 tons of bombs. 23 of its members were killed in action. 30 were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor. And yet, even within the Red Army, these women faced skepticism and discrimination. Male pilots mocked them. Ground crews refused to service their planes. Senior officers questioned their courage and competence. The women responded not with words, but with results. One night witch, Nadezhda Popova, flew 852 combat missions, more than almost any pilot, male or female, in any air force. Another, Irina Sabrova, completed 1,008 missions. These were not symbolic gestures or propaganda stunts. They were acts of sustained, extraordinary bravery under conditions that would have broken most people. The same courage defined the Soviet women who served as snipers. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 2,000 Soviet women trained as military snipers, and they accounted for more than 12,000 confirmed enemy kills. The most famous was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who was credited with 309 kills, including 36 enemy snipers. Pavlichenko had been a university student studying history when the war began. She volunteered for the Red Army in June 1941 and was assigned to the 25th Rifle Division defending Odessa. Over the next 10 months, as the front lines shifted from Ukraine to Sevastopol, she fought in some of the bloodiest urban combat of the war. Sniping is not the cinematic drama of action films. It is a slow, methodical practice requiring infinite patience, Absolute stillness and the ability to kill at distance without hesitation. Pavlichenko excelled at it. She would lie motionless for hours in rubble or mud, waiting for a single clear shot. When the moment came, she did not miss. In 1942, after being wounded by mortar fire, Pavlichenko was pulled from the front and sent on a propaganda tour to the United States and Britain. She became the first Soviet citizen received at the White House, where she met President Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. American journalists asked her trivial questions about her appearance and whether Soviet women were allowed to wear makeup. She responded with icy directness, "I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist occupants by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" Her words cut through the condescension like a blade. Here was a woman who had done what most men would never be asked to do, and she would not be diminished by their patronizing curiosity. The pattern repeated across the world. In Axis nations, too, women were drawn into the machinery of total war, though the ideological framing differed sharply. Nazi Germany, despite its official emphasis on traditional gender roles, found itself compelled by the same brutal arithmetic that forced the Allies to mobilize women. By 1943, with millions of German men dead or captured on the Eastern Front, the Reich had no choice but to bring women into war production. By 1944, more than 7 million women were employed in German industry, many in roles previously reserved for men. The Luftwaffe recruited women as anti-aircraft gunners, radar operators, and communication staff. Young women joined the Reich Labor Service and were assigned to agricultural work, nursing, and civil defense. And in the war's final desperate months, as Soviet armies closed in on Berlin, teenage girls were pressed into service with the Volkssturm, the last-ditch militia formed to defend the capital. They fired anti-tank rockets at Soviet T-34s, knowing it was futile, knowing they would likely die, and many did. In Japan, the pattern was similar. The government mobilized women into factory work, nursing, and civil defense. As American bombers reduced Japanese cities to ash, women formed the backbone of the firefighting brigades and rescue teams. In the final months of the war, as the Allies prepared for an invasion of the home islands, Japanese authorities trained women and children to fight with bamboo spears and grenades. The expectation was clear: total sacrifice. The entire population, women included, would be expendable in defense of the emperor. But the most profound contributions women made to the Allied victory were not on battlefields or factory floors. They were made in secret, in rooms most people did not know existed, doing work that would remain classified for decades. At Bletchley Park, the British codebreaking center 50 miles northwest of London, more than 8,000 women worked to decrypt German communications encrypted by the Enigma machine. They were mathematicians, linguists, and clerks. They operated the massive electromechanical machines, called bombs, that tested thousands of possible decryption keys per minute. The work was tedious, exhausting, and absolutely critical. The intelligence produced at Bletchley Park, codenamed Ultra, allowed the Allies to anticipate German military movements, locate U-boats in the Atlantic, and decipher Hitler's strategic orders. Historians estimate that the code-breaking effort shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years, saving countless lives. And women did the majority of that work. One of them was Joan Clark, a mathematician recruited from Cambridge University. Clark worked directly with Alan Turing, the brilliant cryptanalyst now recognized as one of the fathers of computer science. She was one of the few people capable of keeping pace with Turing's thinking, and her contributions to breaking the naval enigma were essential to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet after the war, when the Official Secrets Act sealed all records of Bletchley Park, Clark's work disappeared from history. She lived out her life in quiet obscurity, her achievements unknown even to her neighbors. It was not until the 1970s, when the British government began to declassify Bletchley Park's work, that the public learned what she and thousands of other women had done. In the United States, similar stories unfolded in the shadows. At Arlington Hall, the U.S. Army Signals Intelligence Center in Virginia, women made up more than 70% of the workforce. They decrypted Japanese military codes, analyzed enemy communications, and provided the intelligence that enabled American victories in the Pacific. One of them, Genevieve Grotchen, was a mathematician who made the critical breakthrough in cracking the Japanese purple cipher in 1940, a feat that gave the U.S. access to Japanese diplomatic communications for the entire war. Her contribution was as significant as any battlefield victory. Yet like Joan Clark, Grotjun's name remained classified for decades. She died in 2006, never having received public recognition for her work. This pattern, extraordinary contribution followed by erasure, defined women's experience of the Second World War. During the conflict, governments praised their efforts, celebrated their sacrifices, and urged them to take on ever greater responsibilities. But once the war ended, the narrative shifted with startling speed. Men returned from the front and reclaimed their jobs. Women were told, sometimes politely and sometimes not, that their services were no longer needed. In the United States, propaganda posters that had once proclaimed, "We can do it," were replaced by images of smiling housewives in aprons, content in their kitchens. Magazines ran articles with titles like, "How to Adjust to Being a Housewife Again" and "What to Do When Your Soldier Comes Home." The message was clear. The war had been an aberration, a temporary disruption. Now it was time to return to normal, except that for millions of women there was no going back. They had tasted independence, earned their own wages, learned complex skills, and proven to themselves and the world that they were capable of far more than society had allowed them to believe. The war had cracked open the door to possibility, and no amount of post-war propaganda could fully close it again. In the late 1940s and 1950s, many women did return to domestic life, but the seeds of change had been planted. The women's liberation movements of the 1960s and 1970s did not emerge from a vacuum. They grew in part from the experiences and memories of the wartime generation, women who knew, because they had lived it, that the limits placed on their sex were not natural or inevitable, but constructed and therefore subject to change. Yet even as social attitudes slowly shifted in the decades after the war, the historical record remained stubbornly male-centered. Textbooks devoted chapters to generals and battles, but barely mentioned the women who built the tanks and planes those generals deployed. Memorials honored fallen soldiers, but not the nurses who died treating them. Films dramatized combat heroics, but ignored the codebreakers whose intelligence made those victories possible. The result was a warped collective memory, a version of history that was not false exactly, but profoundly incomplete. It was as if half the population had simply vanished from the story. This erasure was not neutral. It had consequences. It reinforced the myth that women were secondary actors in the most important events of the 20th century. It perpetuated the idea that war, politics, and power were inherently masculine domains, and it denied millions of women the recognition they had earned, not through symbolic gestures, but through years of grueling, dangerous, essential work. Consider the WASPs again, the American women who ferried military aircraft during the war. They flew every mission asked of them. They took on the same risks as male pilots. 38 of them died in crashes. Yet when the war ended, their program was abruptly terminated. They were given no veterans' benefits, no GI Bill, no recognition. When a WASP died, her family had to pay to have her body shipped home. There was no flag on the coffin, no military funeral, just silence. It took until 1977, 32 years after the war's end, for Congress to grant the WASPs veteran status. And it was not until 2009 that they were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor. By then, most of them were in their 80s or 90s. Many had already died. They received their recognition not in the flush of youth and achievement, but as elderly women at the end of their lives, long after the world had moved on. The Night Witches faced a similar fate. In the Soviet Union, the immediate post-war years saw women pushed out of military and industrial roles as men returned from the front. The official narrative celebrated Soviet women's contributions, but in practice their opportunities narrowed. Many female veterans found it difficult to speak openly about their wartime service. Some faced suspicion and stigma. In Soviet society, there was a persistent, ugly rumor that women who served at the front had done so not as soldiers, but as sexual companions for male officers. It was a vicious lie, but it was repeated often enough that many female veterans chose silence over the risk of being shamed. The Night Witches, once celebrated as heroes, became uncomfortable reminders of a reality that did not fit neatly into post-war gender norms. It was not until the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of archives in the 1990s that their full story began to emerge. Lyudmila Pavlichenko. The sniper also struggled in the post-war years. She completed her university degree and worked as a historian, but she rarely spoke publicly about her wartime experiences. In her later years, she would tell interviewers that the war had changed her in ways she could never fully articulate. She had killed hundreds of men. She had seen her friends die. She had lived for months in conditions of unimaginable brutality. And then, when the war ended, she was expected to return to civilian life as if none of it had happened. The disconnect was too great. She carried the weight of it for the rest of her life. There is a small, telling detail that recurs in the memoirs and oral histories of women who served in World War II, whether in combat, in factories, or in support roles. It is the image of hands, bloody hands stitching wounds in field hospitals, grease-stained hands assembling aircraft engines, blistered hands operating industrial presses, ink-stained hands transcribing decrypted messages. These hands, capable, strong, essential, become a kind of recurring symbol in the literature. They represent not just physical labor, but agency. For years, for decades, for centuries, women's hands had been confined to certain acceptable tasks: cooking, cleaning, sewing, caring for children. The war expanded the possibilities of what those hands could do, and once expanded, the possibilities could not be easily contained again. In this sense, the story of women in World War II is not just a story about the past. It is a story about transformation, about the way crisis can shatter old certainties and reveal new capacities. The women who built bombers, who flew night missions, who broke enemy codes, who treated the wounded under fire, they did not become different people during the war. They simply became visible. The capabilities had always been there. The war created the conditions under which those capabilities could no longer be ignored or denied. And yet, the struggle for recognition continues. Even now, 80 years after the war's end, new stories continue to surface. Researchers uncover forgotten records. Families discover that their grandmothers were codebreakers, resistance fighters, factory supervisors. Each revelation is a small act of restoration, a correction to the historical record. But each also raises a troubling question: how many stories have been lost entirely? How many women did extraordinary things and left no record, no trace, no witness? How many died without ever being acknowledged for what they did? There is no satisfying answer. We can only work with what survives. And what survives tells us this: women were not incidental to the Allied victory in World War II. They were central to it. They were not merely supportive. They were essential. And the fact that this reality has been obscured for so long is not a minor oversight. It is a profound injustice, a failure of memory that diminishes not just the women themselves, but our understanding of the war and its meaning. Because the truth is, World War II was not a war fought by men with women cheering from the sidelines. It was a war fought by entire societies, men and women together, in a collective struggle against totalitarianism. And if we remember it otherwise, if we reduce it to a story of male heroism alone, we do not just forget the women. We forget what the war was actually about. We forget that it was a fight over fundamental questions of human dignity, equality, and freedom. And we betray the very principles for which so many people, women and men alike, gave their lives. On that frozen December night in 1944, when First Lieutenant Mary Louise Roberts finished stitching the wounded soldier's leg, she did not pause to consider whether history would remember her. She moved on to the next patient and the next and the next. Outside, the German artillery crept closer. Inside, she kept working. Her hands were steady. They had to be. Lives depended on it. And in that moment, she was not performing some symbolic gesture of female empowerment. She was doing what millions of women did throughout the war: the necessary work, the essential work, the work that had to be done if the world was to survive. That is the story we must remember. Not as a footnote, not as a feel-good addendum to the real history of men at war, but as the central truth it always was. Women did not support the war effort. They were the war effort, and the world they helped to save owes them more than silence.